You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Tuesday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts right here on the Intrepid radio program on the Odyssey Radio Network here at odyssey1.com. That's ODYSY1.com. You can also watch this simulcast in video over on my YouTube stream, and that is youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Mr. all spelled out. And Scotty with a Y. So Mr. Scotty Roberts. Want to welcome you to the program tonight. And I don't have a topic that... I've got a million topics that run through my head. I've got a million little mini series of topics running through my head. And I'm developing a lot of them. And I'm looking into and even researching and buffing up on some things that I thought I had some weak points on. But tonight, I want to tail spinning a little bit off of last night's episode where I was talking about my brush with Star Trek and the sets, and it brought up a lot of nostalgia, not for the 1990s and the late 80s, but further back. When I was a kid, I grew up in a time where technology wasn't quite as advanced as it is now, obviously. I was born in 1960. I was a grade school kid up until 1970-ish, 71, I think. I went into middle school. And in middle school and all my formative young teen years, I grew up in the 70s. I look at the, obviously, in the 70s, but look at the shows. I grew up in those times where shows like that 70s show, whether you loved it or hated it, and I didn't watch it faithfully or anything, but that represented the years I grew up. That also represented the year I graduated from high school in 1978. So those were the years I grew up, the years of bell-bottoms, of weird clothes, of weird hairstyles, of spinning off of the 1960s into the drug culture and the sex culture of the early 1970s. And we might not think of ourselves as that, but you look back, and that's really what social life was starting to gear around in entertainment, in all the functions of social life, unless you were a Leave It to Beaver type of family. And if you don't know that reference, I can explain that. Unless you were a Leave It to Beaver family, a church family, or something like that, American culture really spun off into free love, free sex, free everything. It was a society that had gotten away from the rigid strictures, if you will, legalisms of the 40s and the 50s and into the 60s. And so that's what I grew up in, was that environment. Not that our family had free love and free sex and things like that, but that was the environment that was around us. And my mom was a single mom at the time, a young woman, by any standard. The times I think back to, she was born in 1942. So in 1972, my mom was 30. And at age 30, in 1972, she had a 14-year-old, a 13-year-old, maybe I'm a year advanced there, a 13-year-old, a 12-year-old, and a 7-year-old. And she was a single mom working as a waitress at one of the little pubs in town, and working for, I think at the time, under $2 an hour was minimum wage, and tips. And so that's how we grew up. And I think we survived probably because my grandfather helped us survive. And we lived in a nice little house in North Minneapolis, and we lived on a corner lot. And it was a nice place for a family that really had nothing. And it wasn't a too bad, too shabby part of town. We are in North Minneapolis. If you're from the area, right on the border between North Minneapolis and what is now Brooklyn Center. And about a block off the Mississippi River and what is now a freeway there in what we called the fields behind the houses across the street when I was growing up. We used to play out in those fields, shoot bow and arrow, ride bikes, climb in fallen trees, build forts in the fall that survived over the winter. And so we had good times out there. That's now all a big freeway coming from Minneapolis to the north of the cities. And so times are different. And back then, technology was different. Everything we did, and of course, we didn't realize it then. We thought we were advanced because we had a little thing about the size of this cell phone in my hand that was a transistor radio. And you could actually take radio in that size, and you could carry it with you. You'd pull out a big, long, 1.5 foot long antenna, and you could pick up just about any radio station on your transistor radio. And so we had transistor radios, man. And we also had, I'm going to pull up a picture here, which you might see this whole process as I'm doing it. Let's see. I want to add an image of bikes. And let's see where we've got it here. These are the bikes that we had, and I'll show you. This is not me, and this is not my friends, but this is what we had back in the, and sorry I didn't do this ahead of time, so you're just now seeing that as I put it all together. There's our bicycles. That's what we rode around in the 1970s. That's pretty much how we dressed, too. And folks on the radio where you aren't seeing the imagery I'm pulling up here, we had the big bikes with the big handlebars and the banana seats and the big roll bars that were in the back, which isn't in this particular picture. But I'm showing a picture of a bunch of kids, 8 to 10, 11 years old, and they're riding their bikes. Those were the fancy bikes. So we had fairly simplistic bikes like that, but we rode the same kind of thing. And that's how we got around. That's what we did. We rode our bikes everywhere. There was little to no fear on my mom's part of any of us being abducted by anybody. That just wasn't in the news. It just didn't happen as much. If it did happen, it was very hush-hush news. It was not the stuff they shared openly all the time. And so times have changed in that respect as well. And so we also didn't have cell phones. If you're like me and you've got young kids, and by young, I mean my kids right now, I've got an older set of 3 from a previous marriage that are all grown up and out of the house. But I have my 3 younger children, which are the half-siblings, if you will, of my older kids, though nobody looks at it as halfsies. So my kids with Rainey. I've got a 10-year-old boy, a 7-year-old daughter, and a 4-year-old daughter. Now, those are kids that I would cringe if I knew they got out of my sight, a block from my house. But when I was a kid, we hopped on our bikes. We rode miles away. We did stuff every day. We just said, "Mom, going to the pool, bye." And we'd hop on our bikes and we'd be off to the swimming pool. And the county swimming pool up in city swimming pool up in Brooklyn Center, which was from the house where we lived 2 miles away. But we rode our bikes up there. Take us 20 minutes to get there or so because we were screwing around on the way. And that's what we did. We'd go to the mall on rare occasions and do things. We'd go play in the fields. We'd go to the local park where the park board had activities all the time in the winter and the summer. And so I started writing a novel once that got all lost in a crash of my computer. And I was able to salvage like a chapter of that. And if I could find it, I'd read it to you. It's not that long, but it was a novel that I had tentatively titled The Paper Boys. And it was a play on words. Paperboy, of course, we were all paper boys, my friends and I. And we delivered newspapers for the local Minneapolis Star and Tribune. And that's what we did. We had evening paper routes. Some of us had morning paper routes. We had the Sunday morning paper route. And that's what we did when we were kids. And we earned probably a whole whopping $4 or $5 every week or so. And that was a lot of money to us. It gave us money to go up to the little corner store about 8 blocks away and buy bottles of pop. Yeah, bottles of pop. For a dime, you could get a bottle of Coke. And if you brought the bottle back, you got a 2-cent return on it. So we did stuff like that. Candy bars, a dime for a Milky Way bar back when I was a kid. And so I would hear stories like this from my own grandfather, and you think, wow, that is the dark ages, man. Were there dinosaurs too? Was the world black and white? And but to me, it's memories of a kid, and these are the things that we had, the things we did when we were out and about, and we wanted to call on the telephone. Here, I'll show you this. Let me call up another picture for you, and you might see all my wrangling around here with this as I call it up. And those of you, of course, on the radio, you aren't going to hear this, but these are the phones that we had when I was a kid. And let me call that up kind of big on my screen for you. That's the phone. We had rotary phones when I was a kid. And we also had the push-button phone. That was the big advance. Ooh, you don't have to dial the brr, and listen to the rotary phone as you're dialing. You could just push the button. And these were the kinds that we had phones exactly like these when I was a kid. And the cords were way too short. And, of course, there was no wireless back then. And so let me call up one more picture for you here. And, again, it's folks on the radio. These are just pictures of phones that I'm showing you from the era, the late 60s and the 1970s. So this particular phone right here, this is what we advanced to. My mom got us a phone that hung on the wall. And it started out like this one, a rotary phone. But it had a long cord. You could walk away from the phone on the wall up to about 20 feet with that stretchy, twirly little spiral cord. And so that was about as mobile as you could get. And then, of course, this phone eventually turned into the push-button phones that my mom got. And when we were out and about as kids, if we were out screwing around and we needed to call home, we did not have cellular phones in our pockets. Oh, no. Oh, no. This is what we had. We had this right here. Every other corner, just about, you could find one of those. Anybody out there who's viewing this on my YouTube know what that is if it didn't say telephone at the top? Folks, that's a telephone booth. And if you remember, like the original Superman, he would always go into a telephone booth, and in the speed of light, he would transform from Clark Kent into Superman, and he'd go flying off. That man had to have a lot of money somewhere because he sure lost a lot of suits in the bottoms of phone booths. But this is what we had. That right there is what we knew as a mobile phone. You had to find a phone booth somewhere. And, of course, as time went on, you had drive-up phone booths. When I was old enough to have a car, we could pull right up to a phone booth and dial a number. But you better have coins on you. And so I think it was when I was a little kid, it was a dime to make a phone call. And it didn't go up to a quarter until I was well into my adulthood, and, we didn't use those very much. And then cell phones started coming out and being more popular in the late 90s. So, a good 35 years after I was born. So this is what we grew up with as kids. And that was the era. And during that time, last night I mentioned that Star Trek was my favorite television show. And somebody in the chat room, I don't remember who it was, maybe it was Anton over in the chat room, I'm not sure who said it, but they said that they grew up with a little black and white TV set. And if I've misrepresented Anton, forgive me, it might have been somebody else who said that. Well, I want to show you, I found this picture. Again, this is not my own picture back home when I was a kid, but this is the TV that I grew up with. And folks, if you're not seeing this, you're listening to the audio, I apologize for that handicap. But that right there, I had a little 13-inch, and it was a Zenith TV that sat on the dresser top in my bedroom right next to the bunk beds, and I had the top bunk. And I used to sit up all night and watch old movies and stuff like this. But if you see on the screen there's Star Trek, Kirk and Spock. But that's how I saw them when I was a kid, black and white. I had no idea that Kirk wore this kind of a greenish gold shirt and Spock's was a blue shirt. I had no clue we grew up on black and white television. And it wasn't until I believe I was in my early teens, or I was a tweener. I was either 12 or 13 when we first got our own color television set. And that was the first thing I did, was I wanted to watch Star Trek in color. And I remember being at a friend's house a couple of years before that. They were the rich family. And, I look at their house now. They lived in a typical middle-class house in our neighborhood up in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, northern suburb of Minneapolis. Dad was a carpenter. And but they had money, as we saw it, because they had a big color television set. And I remember seeing Star Trek in color at his house, and longed for a color television. And we begged our mom, can we get a color television? No, we don't have the money for that. Who doesn't have the money for a color television set? When you look at today's standards, you can go buy a flat screen color television for what? $69, which can be a lot of money for some people. Sometimes you can find them on sale for $30. Those little, what are they, 12-inch screens or something, or 15-inch screens. And so it's pretty cheap to get a color television. I don't think there's anybody in the civilized West that has a black and white television as their main television, although with rare exception. But this picture right here is how I saw the world outside, and how I saw Star Trek, the advanced science of Star Trek, all coming across in 1,000 gray tones on my 13-inch Zenith television set. So these were the things that I grew up with, and this is what life was like when I grew up. We had all of this stuff that represented the advanced technology of our lives, yet they were in transistor form. They were in black and white form. They were in pedaling with your feet and leg muscles form. They were in stopping at a phone booth if you needed to make a call if you were away from home. Times were different. Times were slightly slower. Oh, and I do have a couple of pictures here I wanted to show you as well. When I was a kid, this was my mom's car. Now remember, right now this is a classic, but when I was a kid, this was my mother's car. This right here is, I think, a 1965 Bel Air. Well, my mom had one of these cars, but it was not nice. It was not restored. We were only, 5 to 10 years off from when the car was made. So for my mom, it was an old piece of shit car, is what it was, back in the 1970. And this is what she originally had. It was turquoise and white, just like this one, but a lot more beat up than that. There was no such thing as air conditioning in there. Air conditioning was rolling down your window. But this is the car my mom had when she was a single mom of 3 kids. And then she stepped up. I want to show you what she stepped up to. A couple of years later, she got one of these babies. And I don't know if this was the exact make and model, but I believe it was. She got a Ford Fairlane. And you can see right here, if I can adjust the picture for those of you able to watch, this is the car she had after that. And it was a black Fairlane or something like that. It was this kind of a model. And I remember getting yelled at because we'd crawl up on the roof of the house and jump down on the hood of the car. And she would, because we thought it was a great game. And then she would come out and yell at us, "Don't jump on the roof of my car, you're going to dent it." Of course, these cars were built like tanks back in the late 60s and the early 1970s. So that's what she had. That's what she drove. And so times have obviously changed dramatically since those days. We have our modern equivalents of those things nowadays. A family that doesn't make a lot of money. Single moms or single dads. Even the single dad thing now is a new anomaly compared to the times I was growing up. But all of these things have changed over the years, but we still have those low standards, if you will, low income standards that still exist. But most people have black and white TVs. Most people have functional cars. At least they hope they are, knock on wood. And I look at that and I look back on those things, and I got a little reminiscent, a little nostalgic last night. I'm not an elderly person by any means, But at age 58, going on 59, which is pushing 60, I can see the major changes that have taken place in my life, in life around me, in my environment, in society. Politics, yeah, you can even see it in politics a bit. I was just listening this morning to, and we're not going to get into politics, but just listening to this morning to the news when I was driving my kids to school, talking about this whole Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh stuff and how this story of, quote, new allegations came out, which were obviously, as we all know by now, were debunked within minutes of them actually hitting the press. But the press is still going with some of the stories, even though they know they're false. It's clickbait. It's a way to make money. Now, without getting into all of that, that kind of politicking has always existed, but we didn't see it like we see it now. So even those kinds of times have changed. When I was a kid in 1970, when I was 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, it was the end of the Vietnam War. I missed being drafted for the Vietnam War by only a few years when you think about it. I was 14 when the war came to an end. 3 more years, if that war had still been going, I could have been drafted into the military if I did not enlist. And so those were the times I grew up in. Richard Nixon was the president, and he was impeached, or was going to be impeached. And I'm not clear on that now, if he actually was or was going to be, but he resigned before that happened. He did not want to put the nation through that kind of turmoil. So he resigned. And then, by the way, if you remember, before he passed away, in later decades, he became one of our most senior statesmen that was always looked to for advice and looked to for his input on politics of the day. So that's the era I grew up in. I grew up in the era of Led Zeppelin, of the Doobie Brothers, they came a little later, Chicago, Boston. I grew up in the era of the Eagles, Hotel California, Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, as I got into my later high school days, Ronald Reagan when I was in college. That was the era I grew up in, the era of civil rights, 1968, Martin Luther King, the assassination of King, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, all took place that same year when I was 8 years old. And I saw these things happening and unfolding before me, which turned into the decade of what they would call decadence or free love and all of those things, which we started talking about at the beginning. So that's where I started. Now, I want to take us on a little trip here from those things into looking at some deeper things about the changes and the things we face nowadays. But we got to go out to break. We're at the end of the first segment. Folks, you sit tight. Hang on. I'm going to be gone for 2 minutes, and we'll be right back. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back from that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You are listening to, if you didn't know it already, the Intrepid radio program, and you are listening via the Odyssey National, there, I screwed that up. Listening to the Odyssey Radio Network, nationally syndicated, And you can hear this show in a million different places. But if you want to just hear the audio, you can go to odyssey1.com. That's ODYSY1.com. You can also come over to my YouTube stream, which we simulcast at the same time, and you can see the video version of this show. And just go over to Mr. Scotty Roberts over on YouTube, and you'll find us. Now, I was talking, and as we're sitting here, we've been talking in the first segment about the way times have changed a bit from when I was a kid. Now, I'm not an extremely old person. I'm certainly not elderly by any means. I certainly do have all the little tics and problems and issues that start to come up as the body grows older. I can't do things the way I used to do them. Well, yes, I can. They just hurt more when I'm done. And I also can't party like I used to. I used to be able to put away, a sufficient amount of booze and beer and things like that. Now I've cut back quite a bit because drinking to a partying extent just doesn't feel good anymore. It hurts more in the morning. I'm down for 2 days instead of one. Slow, and it takes me, to get fully sober again, 2 days instead of one, it seems. All that to say, I'm not elderly, I'm just getting older. I'm beyond middle age now, and I've started hitting those things, but it makes you get reminiscent. You look at the things you did 40 years ago, 50 years ago even for me. And when you can start having cogent memories of the things of day-to-day life 50 years ago, you're getting a little older. Because I have fluid, cogent memories of things I did as an 8-year-old kid, a 9-year-old kid, a 10-year-old kid, all of those things that I did. Now, there was something I was going to read for you, and I was going to look this up during the break, so I'm going to see if I can actually find it, because I used to have it over on my website, and that is The Paper Boys, I called it. And it was a little novel that I had started writing. And I'm going to see if just in a basic search, I've still got it on here. And if I do, I'll call it up and I'll read it. Nah, I don't see it anymore. So it's probably very long gone. But it's something that I was writing about my days as a kid. And it started in the mid-1990s. I was spending an awful lot of time after the birth of my twin daughters, early 1990s, at my office, and my wife at the time, I've got a cat in my office who's making noise he shouldn't be making. And I would go out one night, nostalgia, my wife had the kids at her parents' over in Wisconsin, and we lived in St. Paul. And I wanted to spend some time. I was up late night working at my office, which was in uptown Minneapolis. I had an art studio there, and I went and I thought, I'm just going to go drive by the old house where I grew up. And that's the one where I said there's now a freeway across the street on the other side of a barrier, which was all houses when I was kids and open fields. And so I went and I drove by there. And I sat there and just on the little hill across from that street, hoping that nobody would look out their windows and think I was some kind of stalker somewhere. But I was just sitting under the street light with a suit on, and I had my suit coat folded and over my lap, and just sitting kind of, Lotus style, looking at the old neighborhood from that vantage point at the head of the street. And I thought about that for a while, and I thought, I'd kind of like to write about the things that happened to me as a kid, the things I experienced when I was a kid. And so I started to do that, and I used that setting as something that I wanted to write about. And while I'm talking, I'm seeing if I can find that for you, because I think that you'd enjoy that. I'm looking here in a couple of places, and if I don't find it, I'll move on, and we'll do it another time. But if I've got it in here. But I started writing a bit about the things that happened to us as kids in that era. The comings of age, the abuses that took place, the nature of things around us at the time. And because I really just wanted to explore that a little bit. And right now I don't see it, and I don't see it on my website, so we'll skip it for now. But I remember back to those days, and there's a lot of fondness. There's a lot of nostalgia. There's a lot of history there to go through in one's own mind, one's own upbringing. But on the outside of that, the externals to that, was everything that was going on in society around us. There was all this advance in technology that we were right smack in the middle of, and we didn't even realize it. My grandfather worked as a salesman of some sort for a big computer company in the early 1970s. And it was called Hallock Company. And that was back when a computer was the size of a room. And punch cards and all of that stuff. And I don't know who he was selling to or what he was. I never took great interest in what he was doing, just understood that that's what he was doing. And he retired in the late 1970s in his, I think, God, he had to be in his late 50s at the time. And he bought a little island in the north of the Honduras in the Caribbean. And he moved down there. Became a dive master for a scuba diving resort down there. And it wasn't your big resorts. Don't think, Waikiki Beach or anything like that. There were little resorts in the jungle on these little islands. And he lived there until he passed away in the 90s, in his late 70s. But took him all too soon. But he traveled the world. But he sold computers. And so computers were a thing that we really didn't understand. Even when I was a teenager, there was no such thing as a desktop or a laptop that we knew of anyway. And that didn't really hit until the late 1980s. We started seeing the Apple towers coming out. I don't remember the number of them, but they were about 8 to 9 inches wide, and they had the little tiny black and white screen. That was about 5 inches by 5 inches, something like that. And then after that, they came out with the 2CI, which was the first computer I had, which was the big 21-inch color monitor, which was about 30 inches deep and weighed about 100 pounds. And but the things you could do with that was unbelievable in graphic design. And I was in advertising in those days. So watching those things happen. But there was a guy who made some claims back in the late 90s, the early 2000s, that they had developed a lot of their computer technology off of technology that was taken from none other than the back engineering of the 1947 Roswell UFO crash. Now, people, that was mythology in those days, and into a sense it still is today. Did it really happen? Don't know for sure. But what we do know is that we had a big jump in technology. Transistor radios, which I mentioned for this purpose, that was all developed after that time. Now, coincidental? Probably. If you start looking a little deeper, though, was there something? Was there technology that we back-engineered? Did we suddenly go from almost being a horse and carriage society to being the society that we are now? Because there was no exponential leap from outside? I don't know. To say that would be like saying the ancients couldn't have built the pyramids, that they weren't genius enough to figure that out. I happen to believe that the ancients were genius enough and had the engineering skills to build the pyramids, to build those ancient structures, to lift those ancient stones that we can't seem to figure out how to lift today. I think they had methods of doing it. When we look at doing it today, we want to lift that stone in an hour. Hey, it's Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. By 11 o'clock, I want that 50-ton stone over there. Back then, they might have taken 2 years to move that stone from there to there. But they had ways of doing it. There was ingenious ways of doing it. And if you look into some of the theories, which we can cover on these shows in the future, of how they moved those stones up the pyramids and things like that, it's very interesting theory as to how they built these things. So ancient technology meant ancient genius. That doesn't mean there wasn't inspiration from somewhere. Perhaps the gods inspired them to do what they were doing. Perhaps those were existent characters. Perhaps they were dreams. Perhaps they were the things that somebody said, I built this amazing thing and God gave me the insight and the ingenuity to make that happen. Perhaps that's as close to the gods or something otherworldly that people got. Or perhaps it was a little deeper than that. That makes me ask the question, do we think something like that happened? Do we think that there was contact in the past? Do we really know for sure if there was a crash at Roswell and in other places where we back-engineered technology and we came up with some of the tech that we have nowadays? I do know I remember seeing something in the news. It was on the 50th anniversary of Roswell. So this is a while back now. We're talking 1997. So it was 50 years after the event took place. And there was all this stuff in the news about it. Even the Air Force came out and made an official statement how there was no UFO and UFOs didn't crash. And I remember watching the official statement, and they were talking about the part of the theory said that there were also bodies of aliens found in the wreckage. Now, they're denying that the UFO crash took place, but then they started addressing the issue of bodies in the wreckage. And I thought, why would they address that issue at all if it just didn't happen? And what they're saying is, well, they mistook bodies in the wreckage for jump dummies, test dummies, for testing parachutes and testing falls and things like that. The only thing that was very interesting about that statement was, first of all, the seeming contradiction to say that, well, none of this ever happened. It's a big myth. But the bodies they found, we've got an explanation for that. That seems to be contradictory statements at their core altogether. But then they explained those bodies away as test dummies that they probably found. Probably. Well, the interesting thing was the crash at Roswell took place in 1947, but the test dummy program didn't start officially for almost 7 years after that. So he's talking about a program in his official explanation as to what they didn't really find, but maybe found. Yet that program hadn't started for another 7 years. So the Air Force contradicted itself over and over again. Was that deliberate or was it stupid? That's a big question to ask. So all of these things I ask because we went from a rather agrarian culture in the late 1800s to by the mid-1900s, 50 years later, 60 years later, being as advanced as transistor radios and the combustible engine, the telephones, telecommunications, electricity. Look at the advancements that we had in 1950 and 1960 that we didn't have 50 years prior to that. Then also look at the advance from 1950s to present day and where we are today. Now, of course, a discovery can take you from point A to go, whoa, we've just crossed the threshold with this discovery, and that can exponentially open up all different kinds of discoveries further on down the road in very short periods of time. And as you keep building and building and building on top of those discoveries, the time for new discoveries keeps getting shorter and shorter and shorter because they're finding new ways to develop something. Where are we going to be, do you think, 50 years from now? If we don't destroy ourselves in the process, where do you think we'll be? I'd like to talk about, not today, because I don't know enough about it today. I know enough to get myself in trouble mentioning it, but look at CERN and what's going on at CERN. Look at all the technology there. Look at the possibility of bending time. Look at the possibility of energy, the possibility of destroying everything in our existence in a nanosecond. That exists, but then you look at all the celebrations that went on around the opening of that a few years ago, with all the pagan dancing, the pagan rituals, the pagan rites. I know Nancy Planetta and Rafael Martinez, they do Down the Rabbit Hole, and a show right here on Odyssey Network, and they talk about this at great length. You should go look up their shows and listen to this. It's intriguing stuff, but it's going to blow your mind. So I look at the advance just from the time I was a kid to nowadays, and I say something different has happened in the process there. You could look at it very pragmatically and say, as the human race, we've got a lot of ingenuity, which I believe is true. I have said the same about ancient monument structures, about ancient pyramids, things like that. We are a race of genius, of ingenuity, of scientific discovery, of stretching the boundaries. Now, common folk, everyday folk, we don't always think about these ideas. But I guarantee you, a lot of common folk, were they put in situations where they needed to use that ingenuity, they could do it, because we as humans have the brain capacity to make that happen. Now, yes, some have higher IQs than others, however you really measure IQ. Some people have propensities toward science, some toward art, some toward mowing the grass. And he's the guy you hire because he doesn't think that way, doesn't think in mathematical terms. He doesn't want to. He wants to do his job, go home, eat his meat and potatoes, and watch football. That's fine. That's one segment of humanity. And there's another segment that is the, if you will, the genius level, the ones that develop our science force, that develop technology. Not everybody can do that. It takes a special kind of a mind and thinker to do that. I'm not among those. I'm the artistic one. I like to draw pictures for a living. That's what I do. And so we have all of this at our fingertips as the human race. We can look at it from a religious point of view, a mythological point of view, a purely pragmatic, secular point of view. One void of spirituality, one imbued in and throughout, immersed in spirituality. The human race has the ingenuity, has the ability to do great things and miraculous things, and we've seen it all through our history. Is the transistor radio now great technology? No, it's not. 50 years ago, transistor technology was out of this world. You look at a show like Star Trek, and I did a show on this once a while back, the technology of Star Trek. And we've all heard some of these things a bit back and forth, but look at what they accomplished in the television show Star Trek. The theoretical science that was brought to that show, which in turn inspired young minds like mine at the time to say, why can't we do that? Why can't that be created? Why isn't there a real science behind this? So it was actually the imaginations of a Gene Roddenberry and the different sci-fi writers that worked to build that old show that made it so popular and made the kids of that day and age go into science, want to develop these things. Of course, they had the propensity for that to begin with. They had the aptitude to want to do that. But they took those things and they developed things. You've got people working on transportation devices. You've got people working on warp speed. You've got bending space. You don't even exceed the speed of light. You bend space. What does that mean, and how the hell do you do that? There are people actually working on those kinds of propulsion systems, trying to develop them. They're in experimental stages. The cell phone, as we all know, obviously. The cell phone, the flip phones from the old communicators, which I had one on the show last night. It's sitting on my shelf over there, and I don't want to get up and get it. But you flip that open, and we had the flip phones. Those were developed by guys who grew up watching Star Trek. And, of course, now it's become much more. You had the pads in Star Trek The Next Generation. That looked like a flat screen of glass and plastic that had their computer on it that they could carry around with them. Where do you think the iPads came from? It was that kind of technology was developed off of those things. And so there was a lot of ingenuity that was developed because of creativity. Do you think that the first scientific method that happened before we even knew it as the scientific method, didn't begin because there were people who had curiosities about things. What is that great dragon in the sky that makes the sky turn red? I think I want to look into that some more. What's out there beyond what the naked eye can see? Why do you think Copernicus, Galileo were in developing telescopes, trying to see what was out there? Because they knew there was more than what they could see. And so all of this stuff, technology and science, was bred by curiosity and imagination and creativity. Those are the things that started those processes. And so that is exactly what happened in the human race. And it still happens today. The big questions that we ask, sometimes as originists, I like to call us, people who look into the origins of humanity, the origins of the human race, the origins of our technology, the origins of our societies and civilizations. We like to go back to the origins and find out. Some of us think it was natural evolution. Some of us think it was something that was created by a deity. Some of us think it was race interrupted, that there were deities, what we would call deities, or beings from other places, maybe even the same place in other dimensions, that helped us develop out of, wandering naked through the grasses looking for seeds and berries, to suddenly deciding we had to figure out how to farm, or we had to figure out how to hunt, or we had to figure out how to make clothes and build cities. So all of those things, I'm going to no conclusions, by the way, with this show, if you haven't figured it out yet. I'm looking back to the things that I experienced as a kid and where we are today, and then exponentially expanding that to look at where we began as a race and how we got to where we are today. There are also, I think, in the last few minutes here, I want to mention, there are also some things that are pitfalls, that are setbacks, that are problems. I look at current society, and I think one of the most wonderful things that we have at our fingertips is this little device right here. We've got this little cell phone. And this is an iPhone that I have. And I've got a million different programs on this, and I do all kinds of stuff on this. I take my photographs with this. I'm a photographer. I was trained in, here's another advance, I was trained in college. I was a photography minor. One of our professors, or our main professor, was a man who was one of President Nixon's staff photographers at the White House. And he was my professor. He taught us how to use a camera, how to do all our settings, our f-stops, our apertures, our shutter speeds, how to use film, how to develop film, how to burn images in film, all of that stuff we learned. And yet today, while I have all that training as a photographer, I was a minor in it in college, we have this now, where we can take a picture like this. We can look at this thing, and you know what I can do? I can hold it up right here, and I can take a picture, and you know what? There it is. I didn't even have to take that into the darkroom. There it is. And so, and these phones, back about 15 years ago when Rainey and I were first together, I was doing wedding photography. Business I don't really like, but it was somewhat lucrative. I was doing some wedding photography, and I used a digital Canon camera. And big Canon, I called it, regular camera, SLR, but it was digital. And 8.1 megapixels was amazing resolution back 15 years ago. And I was taking weddings with that and portraiture work. Now, this phone right here that I take a lot of my pictures on, I post them on my Facebook. If you saw my Fort Snelling pictures from the other day, taken on this phone, those are all, I believe I'm at 12.1 megapixels on this phone. Look at that technological advance. Just in cell phone cameras, 8.1 to 12.1 in 10 years it took. This phone's about 3 years old. So that's the kind of technological advance that we've had, and we're experiencing that. There are big questions about origins, where we came from. There's big questions about what led us into advance? Is it just purely our mental genius, our ingenuity as human beings? Is it the risk, as Captain Kirk said? Risk is our business. Is that what we're about? Or did we get help from somewhere else? Have the technological advances such as cell phones, that's where I started with that, nowadays, one of the greatest communication technological leaps in human history. Yet it has also created a microbyte society. Suddenly, the things that you can delete and erase here in moments, I don't like that, I'm going to erase it, let's change it, has changed the minds of the younger generation to where we can take time-honored traditions and things and change them in a heartbeat. Why not? Why can't we? Let's just delete and restart. So there are negatives that have come with it. And you know what? Maybe we can talk some more about this stuff tomorrow, because we're at the end of the show today. I hope I've led you down a path of not just being nostalgic. If you're too young to be nostalgic for those old things, give it 20 years. 20 years from now, you're going to be nostalgic about the things that you went through 10 years ago. So, folks, thank you for being here. This has been me, Scotty Roberts, the Intrepid radio program. We're going to go out now for a 23-hour break. You sit tight. We'll be right back.